African American Legends highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, and education. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they had been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I am your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, and joining me on today's program is Ralph Dickerson, who's president of United Way of New York City. Ralph, glad to have you with us on African American Legends, because
nice to see you.
The United Way is a legend, and you're a legend in your own way. And what I'd like you to do is to tell us a little about the origin, the history of the United Way of New York City.
Roscoe, the origin history of the United Way of New York City is similar to the histories of United Ways across this country. They were generally started by religious leaders who were volunteers, who were interested in the human care needs of people in their own communities and neighborhoods. That really is the history of the United Way of New York City. It was those individuals, religious leaders as well as non-religious leaders, who recognized that in New York City there needed to be some collective way of raising money and distributing dollars to needy organizations.
To what extent was this really the corporate and business community pushing the religious organizations and the social organizations, or the vice versa, the religious and social organizations pushing the corporate organizations?
It was really the religious and non-sectarian organizations pushing the corporations. Mm-hmm. A lot of times people believe that it's the corporate interest that's being pushed, but these people recognize who worked in the streets, who worked with individuals, who saw people on a daily basis, the needs. So they push the entities, they push corporations to say there's a need to consolidate our efforts along these lines.
Now, when I was a youngster in Washington, D.C., they have what they call the community chest.
Right.
Now, is the United Way a outgrowth of this community chest idea, which was the same thing?
Absolutely. People
would put money into a pot and then it would be distributed around.
Absolutely. In fact, just prior to Community Chest, it was the War Fund. And so the history of the United Way has really grown up around the various eras in our country, in the history of our country. So it would really move from the Community Fund to the United Fund, and then we became a little bit more stronger relationship and developed the United Way.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the United Way gets a lot of publicity now because of NFL football. They're always talking about the United Way and what it does.
Right.
So let's talk about what does the United Way actually do, and how have those initiatives changed over the past 20 or 30 years?
They've changed dramatically, in part because of a recognition that we knew we had to change, but also in part, Roscoe, because of the various challenges that the United Way had received. Well, one of the issues that we've always had to face is what agencies, what organizations should receive money. And for a long time, because of the relationships that we had, we've had a number of what is defined as more traditional organizations. And I say that with quotes because many of those agencies are not traditionals in the way they provide services, the Y's, the Red Cross.
But they've been around for a while.
They've been around for a long time. And so one of the important evolutions of the United Way is a recognition that we need to not only support those organizations, but also look to community-based organizations, those that either have maybe ethnic or neighborhood or some grassroots origins, and primarily are focusing individuals that have and need special kinds of services that sometimes the larger organizations could not support.
As the first African-American president of the United Way of New York City, you have provided great leadership in helping to focus on community-based organizations, because, as you've suggested, community-based organizations haven't always gotten a lot of United Way money.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, but I think both you and I recognize that in this city that is so multicultural, it's very important that the United Way be responsive to a growing number of individuals who are African Americans, some Latino, some as well as other immigrants that have moved and come to this city. So I think it's our responsibility to not only help those organizations that have been in business for a long time to serve this new constituency group, but also help develop special kinds of organizations that will focus on the needs in those people. The key, though, is for people to recognize that our effort is to try to help them get back into the mainstream of life. That many people are interested in having the same kind of quality of life that you and I have. And so I'm amazed each day, even though the story never gets told, about the number of people who are struggling to make it and are going to make it, families and children, and that's frankly where the voluntary agencies can be of great assistance.
Now, New York City is estimated approximately 25% of the population, maybe 30%, lives below the poverty line. Now, when you meet with your allocations committee to try to decide what kind of agencies are you going to fund, to what extent do you look at whether they fund youth or deal with youth, or whether they deal with senior citizens, or whether they deal with HIV/AIDS, or whether they deal with abandoned wives or abused women? How do you make those judgments? Because that's a very difficult proposition.
It's a very difficult proposition, and it really is a balance that what you really have to maintain. It's partly done, I think, because of our ongoing need for research, which you have a great deal of respect for, and it's been a part of your own life. I think research drives to a great deal the needs of individuals. What we're finding in this city is that in many instances where people's greatest needs are, there aren't always a collection of services, which causes us then to try to encourage those agencies to either move to those areas or provide some support. So research is one of the ways. The second is obviously just being aware from those agencies that are serving people and being sensitive. Many times agencies tell us about trends and profiles that are different in neighborhoods and different with clients that they're serving. And one of the advantages of being a private voluntary organization is that we can move, I think, a lot more flexibly than government can, and provide some important services and provide some important help in those areas. So that's, I think, the second way. And the third way really is a recognition of the people that are around the United Way. It's important that the United Way be representative of a broad constituency of individuals, and namely Latinos and African Americans and women, as well as corporate and labor leaders. And when you get this kind of consolidation, this compendium of people together, thinking about how a city ought to provide human service to people, you're going to get some right decision making. You may not always satisfy people at the level they want to be satisfied, but it shouldn't be because you're out of step and you're unknowledgeable about what's going on.
Now, one of the things I know is a discussion in the voluntary giving community is to whether donations should be targeted by the donor or whether they should be collectively given to, let's say, the United Way for you folks to make the decision.
Right.
One argument is that if donor-designated grants become the predominant way of giving money, some agencies that deal with problems that are not as serious as others may get more money in proportion, and then there's less money to distribute to the larger organizations like the Ys and so on. How do you deal with that?
Roscoe, you put your finger right on the real issue, and you've heard me speak and write about this whole concept of targeted giving. I understand the need for individuals who are giving money to have some say in where their monies are going. And in fact, the more they are involved in determining and understanding where their money is going, the stronger they're going to feel about their giving, and they'll continue to give and they'll continue to volunteer. But the challenge that we face, particularly in a city like this where there are 20,000 health and human service organizations, even the most enlightened giver doesn't always know. So when you begin to have individuals target their money, and when you also have corporations who want to target their money to particular issues, you're absolutely right. You leave out a large number of very viable and effective organizations. In fact, the other greater issue for us are the number of people in New York City, for instance, who work here but live someplace else. They have a desire to want to fund their local volunteer fire department or the one homeless shelter. Well, that's well and good. But if in the urban areas there are not ample human service organizations to provide service to individuals, where people's work, this is where their neighborhood is, and so they also ought to give there, it's even more of a critical problem. And so we're trying to make a case for people to say, look, let's focus on where the greatest needs are and let those dollars flow to individuals to make them as independent as they possibly can, as quick as possible.
And of course, this gets into this whole question of the fact that society increasingly distrusts professionals. Mm-hmm. They don't trust our judgment. Now, one thing you said earlier is that United Way focuses their decisions on the research, on where the needs are. Although some people say because research sometimes is done by mainstream institutions, they don't actually find out where the needs are. And I know that the United Way was very helpful in starting a African American voluntary giving organization, the Associated Black Charities. And I assume that in some way there is still some relationship between ABC, Associated Black Charities, and the United Way. What is the nature of that relationship right now?
That relationship still very much exists. The Associated Black Charities is a federation, and in this city, which is a strong federation town, there's a great need. There are really 7 predominant federations, and Associated Black Charities fills an important need of responding to primarily African American community-based organizations, not only providing some financial support, but also technical assistance, as well as, I think, recognizing the need to continue to lift up the important trends that are taking place around people who need service. It's still an important one, but in addition to that, I think we recognize that African American churches, we have an African American church project that we're doing in conjunction with the Federation of Protestant Welfare Organizations, because you and I well know that the African American churches, at least in this city, have been very avant-garde when it comes to not only delivering services, but contributing to community development. They have not only built quality daycare centers, child care centers, and senior citizens, the housing, but they're also figuring out ways to bring economic development to the neighborhoods. And frankly, that's where United Way and other institutions ought to be. Support African American churches. The congregations want to be involved. They have an investment in those neighborhoods, and that's where we should be.
Now, the mechanism of giving, I understand, is through the workplace. Now, how does that really differ from doing a campaign and say Ralph Dickerson, Roscoe Brown, or to write a check to United Way? How does that differ? Because apparently United Way focuses mainly on contributions through the workplace.
It's a good question, Roscoe. The workplace concept was a relationship that we developed with all kinds of entities, not just corporations. The city university system, for us, is an example of one. Your own campaign when you were the CEO at the college was just soared greatly because of really one advantage, and the advantage was that people had the ability to determine not only where their money is going, but they also had the ability to use payroll authorization. And the payroll authorization eased giving. And one of the cases that we present to institutions and corporations is that the United Way, because of its cost structure, allowing 88 cents on a dollar to be returned to services and only spending 12 cents of that, are able to provide an efficient way of making sure that agencies receive service and people can support those through a workplace campaign. We still think it's alive and well. There are a lot of challenges to it, but the last thing that we ought to use in this philanthropic society, lose, is the opportunity of workplace giving.
I know that United Way of America got a lot of negative publicity. You mentioned 12% on overhead, and I understand it was thought that United Way of America spent a lot of money on overhead, including boats and trips for an executive. Now, of course, those individual things get exaggerated out of proportion, but one of the questions in any type of voluntary agency is how much money is being spent on administration. There's an economy of scale that larger organizations spend a smaller proportion of their money, and smaller organizations spend a larger proportion of their money on administration. Do you have any guidelines for that that you look at when you fund agencies?
Yes, we do. And one of the most important things that we say is that we want every institution that we're supporting to spend less than 25 cents on the dollar for administration. We watch it very closely. Our own expenses by our board of directors and our various committees are watched very closely. And we think that's very crucial towards helping people understand that we have a stewardship for their dollars and recognize that's a good way of making an investment in the community.
Now, you worked in Pittsburgh before you came to New York City. Pittsburgh is known as the home of the Pirates. It's known as a place where August Wilson, a great playwright, did his work. It's known because of the Homestead Grays and Josh Gibson. It has a really interesting tradition in terms of African American cultural history, being a steel town where African Americans migrated. Yet it's also was the steel capital and one time the pollution capital of the world. And then with the cleanup with the corporations, you could actually see the buildings in Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh is still Pittsburgh. Now, how do you relate coming to New York City, 7-8 million people, from Pittsburgh metropolitan area, about 1 million people? How do you relate to that?
Well, every community is very different. Pittsburgh is a great town. The leadership in that town, African American leadership, non-African American leadership, are concerned a great deal about the quality of life in Pittsburgh. And have really worked together to try to make sure that things are done well in that town. That's also true of Cleveland and St. Louis and other communities that I've been in, Madison, Wisconsin. But I think the real difference in New York City is trying to keep the spirit of community alive. See, this city is made up of 500 different neighborhoods as well, you and I. And it's important that the number of people who work here, many of which do not live here, understand the important role that this city to the world really means to so many individuals. And so the challenge I think we face here is trying to help people understand that this is a manageable place, and that while they have lived and worked here and have made money here, that they have a responsibility to invest here, and that we've got to keep things at a manageable side, at the neighborhood level. And when issues are solved and addressed at the neighborhood level, when people feel as if they have some control over their own destiny, they will see some real rewards. And I think that's the real difference. You don't see the light at the end of the tunnel right away in New York City. And a lot of the initiatives that you develop take a long time to make sure they come to fruition. But you got to keep working at them. And I think that's one of the real reasons why New York has been a great place, as well as the other places have been before I got here.
Well, you can see you've been a lot of places, but you talked about all the teams that are losing NFL, all the cities are losing NFL teams like St. Louis.
You could try to say I contribute. Oh, no.
But one concern that some of us who've been around the city have voiced is the declining support of the major national corporations for the United Way and for other organizations in New York City. Some corporations say, I'm a international corporation, I don't have to worry about the city. There are some leaders with whom I work on New York City Partnership who believe that isn't true. People like Dick Jalcott, who's the chair, and Bob Kiley, and people like that, they really understand that. But what has been the experience of dealing with these national corporations in New York City?
We have two phenomena. First of all, we have the phenomena of those major national, multinational corporations that have decided to leave New York City proper and move to the tri-state area, to Connecticut and New Jersey. Some of them still having major business dealings in New York City, but found that their quality of life and business improvement could be better if they moved out. We have some, obviously, multinational corporations who've moved out of the region entirely and gone to other parts. And then we have the movement of foreign companies into our environment. I think both of them represent two different kinds of opportunities for us. First, to help those multinational corporations understand that it's still important to invest in this city and that there's a lot of activity still going on in the city, which is very crucial. On the other hand, for those foreign-based companies that are moving to New York City, to help them understand the philanthropic spirit and to help them get into the groove of recognizing that it's just not all the bottom line in business. There's a bottom line in caring for people as well. And so our strategy has been, the United Way, is to continually educate those companies that are leaving, continually ask them for gifts. If they have any individuals who are still working here, to ask those. Many of them have been responsive, maybe not to the levels that we want, but we got to keep asking. And then also to educate the new ones coming in. And we've had a great deal of success, for instance, with Japanese companies who, a few years ago, to the United Way was giving less than $25,000, they're giving close to $2 million in this region overall and continually growing. So there's some real examples of how the philanthropic spirit can still be alive for people in the city.
New York City is still recognized as the world capital. It's a capital of communications, it's a capital of the media, it's a capital of the theater, capital of the arts, capital of finance, which then leads to the question, how do you get those captains of industry in those areas to recognize that the strength of New York City is its people? True enough, New York City is built on a hard rock, Manhattan in particular builds tall buildings. It's in a great harbor where you can get to. It's got airports, which are a little crowded, but you can still get to. But the strength of New York City is its people. Now, how do we get that? It's 7.5 or 8 million people, and then in any given day, another 2 or 3 million come into the city. How do you get people to understand the value of what we call the human capital of New York City?
Well, Roscoe, it's a very interesting point, and one that you work at consistently every day as you interact with the leadership in this city. Because people sometimes talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. And for a lot of different reasons. Maybe because it's the changing ethnicity of the community. Maybe it's a lack of recognition that some people who are in the city now don't have the labor force skills to do business. Maybe it's just their insensitivity to the growing needs that are taking place every day and because everybody's hustle and bustle. But I think you and I, and so many of us, have a responsibility to keep sensitizing the leadership to understanding that it's the people. It's the people first. And no matter how others will see us, they will see the ways in which we have been able to develop and galvanize and strengthen and provide training for people to move back into the workforce and do things that are necessary. I know the scenario that in order to hire 75 people, in order to hire one person, you got to interview 75 people. Look, that's an important statistic, but the question is, what are you doing about it? What are you doing about it in middle schools to help people understand that there's a different way of life? You don't have to go to the underground economy if you're a young person, or you're that third grader that really is looking for opportunities to stay in this city. So we've got to keep working with the leadership here. We've got to help them understand that there's value in the people. And part of that is through the voluntary human service system, because they're working with these individuals. And the connection between the for-profit and the not-for-profit center to the city, in order to make sure that people understand that the service needs of individuals are being met. And this is a good place to do business.
Now, one thing that the former mayor, Dave Dinkins, did was to try to develop that in terms of the Beacon School idea, getting corporations and others and the city to invest in keeping schools open from 3 to 11 so that you could deal with some of those other types of problems that we face. Right. As the climate changes, less dependence on government, there's going to be more pressure on the private sector. Some of us have doubts as to whether the private sector can step up to the plate fast enough, strong enough to deal with those problems. Difficult problems like HIV, AIDS, difficult problems like spousal abuse, difficult problems like substance abuse. The private sector has always said no and pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. The thing the private sector doesn't acknowledge is that they've gotten a lot of help from the federal government as well in terms of corporate support, et cetera. How do you see this playing out in terms of voluntary organizations, voluntary giving, the voluntary sector making up some of those gaps? I don't think the voluntary sector can make up all of those gaps, and I think there will be a decline in the standard of living if we don't continue to have government support. But how can the voluntary sector, the United Way type sector, work to help fill that gap?
Well, I think the most important thing is to recognize that there are still a number of individuals in this city of fairly substantial means that are not doing enough. Yes.
Could you elaborate on when you say not doing it? You're not giving enough money, not providing enough leadership?
I think so. I think both. First of all, giving enough of themselves. Because when you give of yourself, then you tend to give your own resources out of your pocket. There's still a great number of individuals that are not doing that, who still talk about less government, but have not really understood what their role should be in the private sector. And many of those industries represent important opportunities and challenges for us to really get involved. I think the strategy has to be is the leadership that do understand that message have got to consistently make sure that as a part of their agenda, they make the case to those individuals that while you're talking about less government and while you're talking about the expense of the bureaucracy, that the private sector has to step up. We aren't at that gap stage yet. I mean, we know we can't fill the gap, but we haven't done enough on our gap side to really help people the way we could. There's some very creative models that corporations are trying in the area of human services to help their people in areas of domestic violence, child care, education, a number of the health issues. Corporations have been involved and are experimenting with their own employees and asking for their involvement. Just the whole nature of volunteering, for instance. There are two companies, Chase, as it goes through its merger with Chemical, had a day of caring where all of the employees were asked to go out through the entire region and care. Can you imagine an institution whose focus it is to try to bring about a multi-billion-dollar merger, asking these employees to go out and be involved in an activity like this? It's great. Johnson & Higgins, found its own cultural spirit, found a reason why it had a competitive advantage by allowing individuals to move out like this. So volunteering, carrying the message, making it a top priority on the agenda. Look, if we can solve and address some of the human care issues in this city, Roscoe, this city will be a stronger one. It will be economic vibrant, and will also encourage people to want to do business here. If, however, we don't focus on the human care issue, nobody's going to want to do business here at all.
One thing I've often thought and have often recommended, that if each corporation adopted one of the 1,000 schools in the city, education would already be better. And when I say adopt, I don't mean just put their name on it and send a check. Right. I mean get in there, have the executives get in there, provide some computers, bring their kids to their corporation, etc. And we've said this many, many times over through the partnership and other groups. Not enough of the corporations have really embraced that concept. And I like to say to them that it really isn't as difficult as you think it is.
No, you're absolutely right.
Once you get in there and make your commitment and you see those young people and you see how they grow, there's no reason why you wouldn't want to do it.
That's right. It's exciting for the employees because reading programs and, as you say, sharing of technology resources and providing school work transition programs for kids, shadowing and mentoring, all those different kinds of activities, they don't take away from a corporation's ability to be more profitable. They enhance the employee's ability to recognize that this company stands for more than just the bottom line. So there's a great opportunity here for corporations to really do that. And there are a lot of them that are doing that and have seen that as a focus. We just got to get more doing it. And I think we got to think beyond the fact that it's going to be a Fortune 500 town. Yes, there's still a number of headquarter companies, but this is a middle market town. This is in a segmented, highly segmented town where there's a lot of different industry groups, printing and publishing, the ad agencies, the accounting firms, the consulting groups, foreign banks. People always want to think about the Fortune 500 and forget about the middle market. Yeah. We got to move into the middle market area so they understand that role as well.
And I think it's with the leadership of Ralph Dickerson of the United Way of New York City, giving the message which you've just given, that gives a lot of us hope, and hope the message continues. Thanks again for being with us.
Leadership, Roscoe. You're a terrific person. I appreciate it a great deal.
Okay, thanks for being with us on African American Legends.